Great. I think we could get started then. So, welcome to Tipping Points, where we ask the questions that matter about how we balance conservation and development. I am André Tranquilini, and I am today's facilitator of this 12th Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation Tipping Points webinar, where the focus today is about food security and biodiversity, and we'll be exploring ways of finding a balance. Please, everyone, note that the session is being recorded and will be posted onto our YouTube channel. As mentioned, please feel free to introduce yourselves through the chat box during the webinar, and as well as ask questions through the chat box. And if you'd like, please sign up to our quarterly newsletter. You can receive updates about future Tipping Points webinar. Before I invite the panelists, I just want to give a little bit of my background. I am originally from Brazil. I am a biodynamic farmer. I'm a consultant and a teacher. Currently, I manage a 220-acre biodynamic estate in the UK. And we have quite a wide range of production, different enterprises, from cereal growing to livestock farming and horticulture and so on, all supported by this biodynamic ethos. I have worked in the past extensively as a market gardener, as an outdoor classroom teacher, and I have been a founding member of the seed company Living Seeds in Portugal, sorry. So this webinar will be structured with 3 panelists, give some input into the topic, then we're going to have a question and answer and a wider debate on the topic. So I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for today. So first of all, I would like to introduce you Dr. Hayley Clements. Hayley is a researcher at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University. She's interested in understanding how biodiversity connects to human well-being and the role of African wildlife economies in achieving just and sustainable development. Hayley is currently leading a project that is bringing together over 200 experts in African biodiversity to produce a biodiversity intactness index that monitors how much biodiversity remains intact in the face of human pressures across the continent. And this work is funded through the Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer Grant. So welcome, Hayley.
Thanks very much, André. Pleased to be here.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as I have a couple of slides to share with you. Okay, André, can I get a thumbs up, please, that you can see my screen? Excellent, thank you. Let me set my timer. So thanks for that great introduction. And as André said, I've been working on this project for the past few years in collaboration with over 200 biodiversity experts across the continent to map the impacts of land use activities on biodiversity across the region. And so what I thought might be interesting to share with you today is the land uses across sub-Saharan Africa that are food production related. So what you can see here are on the left-hand panel is the extent of croplands. These are predominantly cereal crops across sub-Saharan Africa, where that's on a scale from per 1 by 1 kilometer pixel, how much of that landscape is covered by cropland. And in total, that amounts to about 14% of the region that's covered in crops. And then in the middle there, and I think really importantly, this often gets overlooked, is the field size of those croplands. I put the link to the data source there, and this is an amazing piece of work that crowdsourced information on field sizes across the world. And what's really striking in an African context is that the majority of farm fields are smallholder. They're less than 2.5 hectares. So that's really striking. And coupled with that is the extremely low input of fertilizer into croplands across the continent. And these two things are important because, of course, these are much less intensive croplands, which has implications for biodiversity, but it also has implications for the yield that comes out of those croplands, something that I'll come back to towards the end. We can also then map rangelands. So these are areas across sub-Saharan Africa that have predominantly natural vegetation remaining, unlike croplands, and they're used to graze predominantly sheep, goats, and cattle. And so you can see the spread of those animals across the continent as well. And so bringing these two types of food production together, what we did was produce a map of cropland and rangeland intensity across sub-Saharan Africa. So rangeland intensity is the density of those livestock animals, controlling for rainfall and also soil nutrients that are available. And the cropland intensity is the extent of those croplands, the amount of nitrogen, and also the field size. And then what we did is we engaged in an expert elicitation process with, as I mentioned, over 200 experts in African fauna and flora, different species, and we asked them to estimate how different land uses and intensities of those land uses are impacting on biodiversity intactness. And so biodiversity intactness is an index that shows us the average remaining proportion of intact populations of the diverse vertebrate and plant species that you get across the continent. And intact means what their abundance would have been pre-industrial. And so what you can see here, the green are higher in intactness levels, closer to pre-industrial, and the red are really low, where we've lost the majority of biodiversity abundance. And so what you can see here is that it maps, correlates quite strongly with particularly cropland area and especially the more intensive croplands, but also the more intensive rangelands that have an impact on biodiversity. But I think what's equally striking is how much green there is left on this map, and the significance of particularly rangelands and near natural lands in contributing to that. So rangelands, of course, are in the more open systems across Africa, whereas there in the center is mostly forests, where it's more challenging to graze animals. So if we look in aggregate across sub-Saharan Africa, we have about 75% of biodiversity intactness remaining. We've lost then, of course, 25%, and this figure just shows you where the intactness we've lost, which land uses those are in, and the intactness that remains, which land uses those are in. And I think what's striking here, if we look at what remains, is that a lot of what remains is in the near natural areas, but the rangelands and the croplands also contain a fair amount of remaining intactness, and in fact, more than we see in protected areas. Now, the reason for this is because of extent. So protected areas, of course, are critical for conserving particularly larger, more wide-ranging species, Africa's charismatic megafauna, etc. So per unit area, they conserve more biodiversity intactness, but they only cover about 6% of the region, compared to, as I showed you before, our croplands cover about 14%. So I think a key message here is that we need to recognize that a lot of biodiversity remains in these areas that have people in them, and to recognize those people as stewards of that biodiversity. So looking forward then, firstly, in terms of what is the future of our croplands, we know that sub-Saharan Africa has one of the most rapidly expanding populations in the world. Africa is going to be grappling with the challenge of feeding more people as the population grows. And I think people often talk about two potential scenarios. The one is to intensify the croplands that exist. So this figure shows you the distribution of existing croplands in terms of their percentage contribution to all the croplands you see in that map. And as I mentioned earlier, we see that currently most of those croplands are smallholder croplands. They conserve a lot more biodiversity intactness, but their yields are much lower. And so the question is, do we intensify? That's kind of the normal trajectory of agricultural increasing agricultural yields, which loses biodiversity in those croplands, but it also means we don't lose near natural lands that conserve a lot more biodiversity. And of course, the contrary to that is that we expand croplands, and based on the increase in yield over time in Africa, this is where we expect to go, which of course means they then expanded to more natural areas. And I think useful perhaps for us to discuss and learn from the farmers in the room is whether there's an alternative. Does intensification have to look like the two pictures we see here, or are there other ways to improve yield that aren't so negative towards biodiversity? And then to conclude, of course, what is the future of rangelands and near natural lands? There are many examples across southern and eastern Africa in particular where people actually coexist their livestock with wildlife. So how do they do that in ways that are sustainable? Can we bring in wildlife economies that actually enable them to generate revenues from that wildlife, incentivizing its conservation, and also using it for food security? And how do we promote sustainable rangeland management? And I'm going to end there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Hayley. That's amazing how much you managed to put into 7 minutes. I had so many questions and things I wanted to comment on, but I hope we'll find some time to do that during the debate and the chat. So they're fantastic. So our second panelist is Fazlur Pandor, and he's a seasoned entrepreneur with extensive experience in the agricultural industry. He has founded 2 businesses in this space, Urban Fresh, and most recently Pumpkin.io, both of which specialize in providing business building support to small and medium-sized enterprises in the agri-sector. Fazlur is committed to realizing his vision of facilitating access to finance and other forms of supporting for emerging farmers and other agri-SMEs, alongside his dedicated team and like-minded partners. So thank you so much, Fazlur, and yeah, would love to hear from you.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the introduction, André, and very interesting presentation as well, Hayley. I think what you displayed correlates with a lot of what we see on the ground, the work that we do with farmers. So yeah, I think I'll be approaching this from a farmer's perspective, being a farmer and with the work that we do in developing farmers. And I think the first thing is, to be clear or own what we do as farmers as well. And essentially, as a farmer, you go into an area, you change the natural landscape to provide what you want out of it, to produce a crop, etc. And if we start with that and accept that that is what farming is doing, and it's not that all the farming is about, but it's a large part of it, then we also kind of have to understand that there will always be a bit of a trade-off between biosecurity and food security. And this arises from the fact that in order to maximize food production, we often have to consider, if not undertake practices that can sometimes have a negative impact on biodiversity. And I think owning that is part of starting to address the challenge or the problem. And this happens across the spectrum of farmers, right? So from the smallest scale farmers, where we look at and we see issues with regards to things like overgrazing, deforestation, slash and burn type of approaches, going all the way up to the larger, more industrialized commercial farming operations, where we have issues with regards to overuse of pesticides, over tillage of land. But in either case, it results in the same kind of problems of destroying habitat for wildlife, decreasing soil fertility, reducing abundance of pollinators and helpful insects, for example, and then also issues like soil compaction. And I'm mentioning these because those type of issues also in turn have a direct impact on the farming business. And if farmers are about, for example, trying to increase their yields, it's very important for us to make sure that farmers have an understanding of the circle effect that these practices have and how it can basically come back to bite them in the future. And we've seen this happening in maybe more in other economies, but certainly it's something that we need to look out for and protect against in Africa. If we look at the rangelands and the planted lands that Hayley showed on her slides, and if we talk about expanding those, let's make sure that thinking is already there now in terms of how we protect that biodiversity or get more efficiency out of the land that's already being farmed. And I think the good news, though, is that the narrative is changing. I think historically, and I started farming about 10 years ago, so maybe I can speak to then when I started. The talk or the feeling around with a lot of farmers was that pursuing a more ecological approach to farming, not even to say necessarily full certified organic farming, but just anything that goes more in the ecological way was risky, because farmers are thinking, okay, is this going to impact on my yields? Is this going to increase my costs of production? Am I going to be spending more on labor, etc.? You start talking to a farmer about intercropping or using less pesticides, and especially then you'd see the fear and the concern on their face. I think part of it also during that time, and even in the conversation now, has to do with how the message is being translated to farmers. And that's maybe something we can talk about more in the Q&A, but I found that sometimes a fundamentalist approach to agroecology doesn't really work with farmers. And we also need to think about how we approach. But generally, I think the narrative is changing, and there's definitely a growing understanding from farmers. There's also been enough time, I think, for farmers to actually see the results, because the results of the changes that we talk about when we say moving to agroecological ways of farming don't happen immediately. But there's been time that's passed now where farmers are starting to see the benefits. I could speak again on my own farm, where 2 to 3 seasons or 2 to 3 years after making the changes, and you start to see how the soil biology plays such an important role in your production. Again, there's different types of farming, right? But we talk about genetic diversity playing an important role. I think of the livestock farmers who, for the longest time, farmers were so proud to have their pure breeds of cattle, but are now seeing the importance of interbreeding those with indigenous breeds and how it improves the resilience and the performance of the animal. So there's certainly a change that's happened and happening in the farming space, and I think very positively. I think what the question is now is, how do we increase the pace of that change? And also, how do we allow for growth? And again, this maybe comes back to that question I said about, not being too fundamentalist in our approach, growing the agricultural sector in a way that addresses the real needs of, now in this context, Africans and African economies. We have growing economies. We have farmers who need to survive financially. But at the same time, we have a very important ecological and climate related agenda that also needs to be looked after. And how do we approach that in a way that satisfies, if I can say, both sides of the conversation? And I definitely think there are ways to do that. Hopefully we can unpack that a bit. I don't want to go over time, but there's certainly ways to do that. That's a lot of the work that we do with farmers, and it's an evolving conversation, I think a very interesting one. And I don't think we've hit on all the answers yet. But this is, maybe I can pause there and say that from a farmer's perspective, I think these are some of the challenges that farmers grapple with when they're faced with the topic of biodiversity and their businesses, and how do they play a role in that whole ecosphere. I'll pause there. Wow,
great. Thank you so much, Fazlur. It really exciting. It's really exciting times as well to do what we're doing. I'm constantly having this conversation with my young children, and because part of the message that they are seeing in the world is of concern, it's doomsday. And I understand how privileged it is to be saying this now, but by doing what I do, which sounds very similar to what you do as well, I've seen life improving in terms of wellness, in terms of people, in terms of biodiversity. Yes. So I'm a hopeful person like yourself.
Well, great, we certainly share that.
So, and thank you very much. So we'll talk about some of those points later as well. So our final panelist today is Dr. Elizabeth le Roux. Dr. Elizabeth is a South African ecologist and is assistant professor at Aarhus University in Denmark. Did I get that right, Lisa?
Close enough.
And a fellow of the Mammal Research Institute at Pretoria University. Her research focuses on large mammal interactions and the impacts that they have on Africa's savanna ecosystems. She studies the mechanism through which large mammals, inside and outside protected areas, create landscapes that facilitate the persistence of species and the maintenance of biodiversity. Dr. le Roux is involved in research projects in Europe and Southern Africa and has been a guest speaker at various universities and events. She is the recipient of last year's JWO grant. So thank you, Lisa.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me. I feel as though I'm probably the least qualified to be speaking on a discussion on food security, but I do work quite a bit with biodiversity, not necessarily so directly as Hayley does, but I work more on a kind of systems perspective of what are the characteristics of a landscape that supports biodiversity. So biodiversity in all spheres. So not necessarily just large mammal biodiversity, but also like plants and soil, microbes and things like that. So, but I am essentially a large mammal ecologist, and I work really on two different types of topics. The one being interactions among species, And the second that's more relevant to today's discussion is I work on how large mammals impact their environment and how they create variability and heterogeneity and structure in landscapes, and thereby control the functionality of those landscapes. So, for example, I work on how animals and animal impact, particularly large animals, create vegetation structure in the grass layer. So how they create variability in short grass patches and tall grass patches, and how they do how they shift species composition, for example, especially in grass layers or tree grass ratios. And then the reason why this all links to biodiversity is because this then has knock-on effects and indirect effects on other really influential dynamics, particularly in savannas, things like fire dynamics. And of course, that will then have a lot more impact on the landscape. I also work a lot on how they create, large mammals being large mammals, create nutrient landscapes or shape nutrient landscapes. So by eating in one place and defecating in another, they move nutrients and elements across the landscape. And by being selective in what they eat and which species eat which things, they end up creating heterogeneity in which nutrients and which elements are moved and distributed to which areas. So in that way, they kind of shape chemical elements across the landscape, and that of course has a lot of indirect consequences to system functionality and to which kinds of species can be supported in a landscape, and how many of these species can be supported in a landscape. And so in all of these things, it always kind of ties together in the heterogeneity that is created within systems. And by heterogeneity, I just mean the patterning, so the patterning in nutrient distribution, or the patterning in vegetation structure, and the patterning in where fire impacts. And this ties directly to biodiversity, because the more heterogeneity you have in the landscape, the more niche space you create, and having more niche space supports higher levels of biodiversity in, at different scales and across different taxa and so on. So as André said, I am a South African originally, but I now live in Denmark, in Aarhus. It took me a very long time to pronounce that, and I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. So let's just leave it there. But I live in Denmark now, but I still work a lot. The majority of my work is still in African savannas, and what we're trying to do is to take what we understand about how animals create heterogeneity and support biodiversity in their impact on landscapes, in savanna landscapes, in these places where you still have relatively intact large mammal communities and relatively intact systems, and also systems where these impacts have continued to play out over the long term. So taking this understanding within these relatively intact environments, and then trying to apply it to more temperate systems, and specifically to systems where one's trying to restore, and there's a huge rewilding drive in Denmark and elsewhere in Europe, where the intention is to place animals back into environments that are degraded, to help get that impact from these animals to recreate this heterogeneity and patterning that is intended to support these ecosystem functions and the biodiversity. So yes, that is what I do. So in a much more broader sense than, I think Hayley works directly with the biodiversity distribution, whereas I work a lot more with system functioning how do we manage systems that support high levels of biodiversity, both in a protected scenario, a protected landscape, but also in our production landscapes, and how do we manage these production landscapes that we can find that midway, that compromise that Fazlur was talking about, between production and biodiversity. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Lisa. The three of you have been extremely good at keeping up to the time. So we actually have, if you would, any of you would like 1 or 2 more minutes to extend on any of the points, or we can do it. Otherwise, we can just jump into the questions. I'm happy to take your lead on that. No? Great. Super. So I suggest we'll start with the questions. Thank you very much for those who have sent questions before via Eventbrite. So I'm going to start perhaps with Lisa and answer. I will ask the same question to Lisa and Hayley, just sort of really trying to put into the context of their research as well. So how do we drive equitable and just transitions? How do you drive equitable and just transitions in the African landscape?
Yes. So as I was saying, my work focuses a lot on the biodiversity component and managing these ecosystems. So if I were to think about how one would support this transition to just and equitable transition to sustainable landscapes, I would think that a lot of that lies in good governance. And 3 things I think come to mind. The first being that specifically, if we're talking about how do we do this in an African context, I think one of the really important things that we need to keep in mind is that we need to create solutions that are local solutions that are more informed by how we are used to in African systems, how we are used to managing and viewing African systems. And I'm not just talking about systems in terms of ecosystems, I'm talking about socio-ecological systems. So how have we used the systems in the past, and how do people view land and nature and so on. And I think this is it's important to not have a view of how we achieve this that was maybe specifically developed in, say, Europe or outside of Africa, and then superimpose it on African systems, because I'm specifically thinking about things like the view of ownership and in Africa, land ownership, and where a predominantly European idea of individual ownership has led to this parceling out of land and individual people owning small patches of land and fencing it off and whatnot, and that has been hugely detrimental to biodiversity and to connectivity, which of course also supports biodiversity. So the first thing I would think is really supporting local solutions. And then I think the second thing is that we as the government for one, but then also we as a society should invest in supporting ecologically sound management principles, because there are ways in which we can have a production landscape that supports biodiversity, but it's not going to be free. And at the moment, we do have a lot of subsidies and things that are going towards practices that are harmful to biodiversity. And I think that we have a capacity to redirect those subsidies to support practices that are actually would boost biodiversity and would boost ecosystem function. And that kind of goes together with what I think the third thing is, and both Hayley and Fazlur touched on this in their opening remarks, but I think that it's really important that we have to make sure that these incentives flow towards small-scale farmers. If it's going to be an African solution, I think small-scale farmers should be, very much a part of where we design those, for whom we design those solutions. Because I think, as Hayley showed in her maps, it's a huge proportion of our production landscape in Africa. And once if you incentivize in that way, and you making these decisions easier and more affordable to small-scale farmers, you would also automatically address things like, small-scale farmer rights. So things like access to the land and access to fair wages and these kinds of things that I think will all support the ability to be able to make the right decisions for biodiversity and ecologically supportive decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, Lisa. Hayley, would you like me to comment on that? Would you like me to read the question again?
I'm happy for you to comment, André, and then I can come in.
No, sorry. Would you like to comment on that? Yeah.
Okay. We'd like to hear from you as well, given your extensive expertise. But yes, okay, I'm happy to do that. And I guess perhaps building on what Lisa has said, I think I very much echo her sentiments that the transition to something that's just and equitable towards a more sustainable future does need to be led by African solutions in an African context. And just speaking from my experience in my own research, what actually prompted this project to map biodiversity and intactness for Africa is because of how appalling the existing products are for Africa. So there have been actually global attempts to map biodiversity and intactness. And when you look at them for the African context, they just make no sense. And some examples, I think, of why that is because they've extrapolated from data and lessons learned elsewhere across Africa because there's less data here. So for example, rangelands flag up as horrifically red, almost no biodiversity left. And I think the reason for that is because they're learning from intensive pasturelands in places like Europe that are radically different systems. And another example, and I mentioned it in my talk, is that if you look at maps of cropland, they don't differentiate smallholder from large scale. Lisa mentioned that as well. And these kind of differences are really important. So I feel the research that I'm engaged in and others like it the first step from a research perspective to enabling a just transition is to have a more context appropriate understanding of what we're dealing with. And so, so that's kind of the starting point. And then I think once we have that, we can start to ask these important questions. So I see, for example, in the chat, Lesa, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but a really important question there about land sharing or land sparing. So, I spoke about that at the end of my talk as well, like, the prevailing narrative is, should we intensify or should we expand? And of course, this land sharing or sparing relates to that. Do you have intensive croplands with set aside areas for nature, or do you have much less intensive croplands where nature's, much more interspersed? And honestly, I don't have a firm opinion on that because I'm hesitant, because I feel a lot of the research on that topic has come from elsewhere. So I think, once we have better products and understanding of systems in Africa, then we can actually start to better engage with those questions and understand, in certain contexts, what is better or worse. And then with that knowledge, also leverage, for example, international financing, biodiversity financing, but also climate change financing, etc., to then unlock those kinds of systems. So yeah, I feel like a really important starting point is just, African-led knowledge and learning from the people on the ground to help enable those transitions.
No, I completely agree. I'll say something extremely simplistic. That always when I'm teaching farming or gardening, I say that there is no recipe. Even, if I'm looking within one specific field on my farm, the left top hand corner requires a total different practice technique than the bottom part of the field. And that's, how could we extrapolate European solutions to the African continent? It doesn't make any sense at all. And I think it's really important to empower people to be understanding their environment at such a deep level of understanding of the environment that they can be part of that solution process. It's the only way forward, Hayley. As you were showing in your presentation, we cannot exclude the humans, isn't it? They have these people who are the caretakers of this land. And one of the questions that I had for you, Hayley, it was when you were showing your, I think, last slide or the one before last, and you had the graph, and there were two possible directions, either intensify or expand. And then Fazlur brought an element of, well, can we make it better what we currently are doing? So I'm assuming that graph can go many directions still, isn't it?
Exactly. I think that's, that's such an important point, and we need to learn from people like Fazlur and yourself and others in the room. There's these very dominant narratives that give you these two options, and yeah, I think it's important to really think out of the box about beyond those two dimensions. Yeah.
Thank you. And if I may, Hayley, I'll then ask you another question that came before via the Eventbrite. In essence, how do we encourage a nature-positive culture amongst farmers, where traditionally farmers have fought against nature?
André, I was quite struck by that question, because I was surprised that the assumption or the narrative is that farmers fight against nature. I mean, I'm not a farmer, but I feel that farmers are the people working on the land that have the greatest appreciation for nature, particularly, I think, smallholder farmers, that really are vested in the land compared to much more commercial operations. So I must say I was surprised by the question, but again, I'm not a farmer. But coming back to what I showed in my presentation, I think that people think about biodiversity and nature conservation in protected areas, and then they think about farming as bad for biodiversity. And I think that we need to shift the narrative to recognize and celebrate farmers as the custodians of the majority of remaining biodiversity, and perhaps if society better appreciates that is their contribution, then that might also shift their own perspective of having to fight against nature into celebrating it. But I also think we can't romanticize smallholder farming. As I mentioned, I think I actually had quite a striking stat here that of the poorest people in Africa, 75% of them are employed in the agricultural sector. So I think for farmers to be able to not feel like they're fighting against nature, they also we need to enable their resilience to be built, so that it's not a fight, a struggle every day. It's unfair to expect farmers trying to make ends meet to be the custodians of biodiversity if we don't support them better.
Fazlur, would you like to comment on that? I could see you. You're on mute.
Forgive me, sorry. What I was to say is that one of the things I wanted to say around that question as well, and where we've seen success with farmers, is trying to make the conversation relevant to them as well. I think, if we have a farmer and we have a conversation with a farmer, and the conversation is, biodiversity, and we may be talking about the macro fauna, which he's trying to clear to open up a hectare of land, then we might be starting the conversation with that farmer a level past where we should be, I think, there. And so where we saw a lot of traction with farmers and getting the whole biodiversity conversation started was to say, okay, right here on your land, do you understand that biodiversity happens in the ground? Like, just let's just talk about the soil for a bit, and the soil food web and the biodiversity that needs to exist there. And also, by making changes, you can quite quickly demonstrate the results of increased biodiversity. And then it becomes a bit easier to extrapolate that conversation to say, look, similarly, as you can see, these benefits here. Now, when we spread it out, it's maybe not as easy for you to see, but you understand now the chain of when we start to improve things that you can't see, it starts to improve things that you do see. And that's kind of the conversation that we have with some of the farmers. So I think it's about making it relevant. I think what also helps to make the conversation relevant for farmers is, remember that for, I could say most farmers, if not all, farming is an economic exercise. They're doing this to pay their bills, to feed themselves, and hopefully to create a better future for their kids, etc. And by, again, bringing the conversation to speak to those pain points of the farmer, how is biodiversity going to help me increase my yields? How is biodiversity going to help me expand my farm, use my water in a better way, etc.? I think that's how we can also have the conversation land with farmers in a more effective way.
Thank you. Hayley, did I understand right? Your research is also looking at yields as well. Is that correct? No.
No, unfortunately, my research doesn't look at yields, but hopefully by overlaying an understanding of yields, then we can better grapple with this kind of land sharing versus land sharing debate.
Great, thank you. So my next question as well came through Eventbrite, and that's for Lisa. Are we not compromising ecosystem functionality by using it for harvesting?
I think that it's the answer comes down to how are we doing the harvesting, and how much of the land is allocated to pure harvesting, pure production. It's about how we design these production landscapes, I think, because there are certainly ways in which we can design production landscapes to support biodiversity, and but it is going to require profound restructuring in how we manage these systems and how we finance these systems, because even though I think there might be opportunities that to boost biodiversity, that's not going to cost the farmer anything, but the majority of it, we have to admit, it is going to be more costly to implement, or it's going to be more it's going to have a lower income per kilometer square of the farm or whatever. So there's a cost involved, and I think it's important that is then where we must support as a society, where we have to support those decisions, where those subsidies that I was talking about before should be able to incentivize that. Like, for example, the heterogeneity that I was talking about, that could be costly to implement and costly to maintain, and it might take away from income. But if those subsidies, if we can reallocate those subsidies, and that supports that, and us as a society supports the subsidies too, because we have acknowledged that we need and want to conserve biodiversity, then I think that is how we can prevent this eroding of our biodiversity, and I think also by spreading our impact, to know that we can have multiple different strategies all in one basket. So we can have areas that we save entirely for nature, and have protected areas that we say, okay, let's not touch this. But there's a lot that we can do within our production landscapes to support biodiversity within the production landscape itself, but also the system, the surrounding system that biodiversity needs, even within the areas that we are actually saving entirely for them. And I'm talking specifically about connectivity between more natural sites, and allowing the ability of animals to move and repopulate areas that are perhaps less impacted. So thank you.
Fazlur, do you think there's a conflict between food production and biodiversity? I think part of the conversation we heard there's historically being that way. What I was wondering, if you think, can food production benefit from biodiversity, from more diversity within that farm or garden?
Yeah, I think certainly food production can benefit from biodiversity. I think, like anything, or many things in nature, these are not quick fixes. It's not like flicking a light switch on and off. But given time for changes to show their results, absolutely it can. I've personally worked on several farms, like I said, my own included, where making changes, or for example, just a philosophical change about thinking about the soil food web, first and foremost, even plant a seed, has increases in yield, decreases in, and we're organic certified fertilizer use, just because the soil is healthy. So absolutely a difference can be made there. And then I think we talk about sort of wider, more sort of a conservation approach to biodiversity, absolutely as well. I think that there are avenues, and I think Lisa spoke to it a little bit as well, where farmers can be incentivized to protect more of their lands, you know, recognizing when you have wetlands, for example, on your farm, being incentivized to protect them. And that could be coming through policy, for example, or subsidies, etc. But there's a lot that could be done. And I think that the relationship is almost unfair in that biodiversity can do more for farming right now. I think we'll immediately a lot of farmers. And as farmers, you know, we need to think about what we can be doing for biodiversity. But biodiversity is almost hand in glove with good farming these days.
And do you find enough evidence that you can support when you're talking to farmers? Is there a body of work, or do we need Lisa and Hayley to do more research to support us? Yeah, how can you evidence some of the arguments when you're talking to the farmers? How can you communicate some of that?
Yeah, I think, again, what I've found that honestly, the greatest evidence is by being able to demonstrate results. So it does take us some time. And we don't rush, because a lot of the work, as I said, we do is trying to convert farmers from conventional to organic production. And that's a process. Yes, there are increasingly more examples, but again, now speaking from South Africa, a lot of them are international examples. And I think the thing with farmers, it's, you know, we operate on trust a lot. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, is kind of the approach. And, you know, the first thing is trying to get farmers to understand that, no, look, actually, it is broke. Maybe you haven't experienced the increased yield, so you don't realize that, but the system is broke, or it's close to breaking. But once we get that across, yeah, absolutely, then we see the changes, we see the difference. But it can take time, and no, there isn't necessarily, I think, one point of truth right now to speak to. And I'm not saying that there isn't evidence or research that's been done, but how relevant is it at the, you know, in the farmer's hands? And remember that farmers are also not homogeneous. So, you know, from the small scale subsistence farmer to the large scale commercial farmer, the approach and the messaging is also a bit different. And there may be more research on one side and a lot less on the other.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll combine a couple of questions from the chat, and I'll ask, and then please, whoever wants to jump in, please do. They're both sort of human related. So our population expected to double in the next 30 years. The demand for meat will increase dramatically, so putting pressure on environmental and more specifically biodiversity. What are some practical solutions while focusing on biodiversity conservation? And the other question, again, highlighting there are many more issues to consider when achieving food security and conservation. The discussion is interesting, but in his opinion, there's a missing link on addressing the major problems such as poverty and education. Anyone want to comment on those?
Sure, maybe I can comment on the second one, because as I said, I think that is absolutely part of the solution. I think earlier when I was speaking about making the conversation around biodiversity relevant, it can't be a one-way conversation that says you need to become more green, more ecologically responsible, Mrs. or Mr. Farmer. It also needs to be a conversation that understands, why are you farming in the first place? Why are you farming in the way that you're farming? Is it because you honestly believe that this is the only way to farm? Is it because it's all you know, or the way that you know farming, and if you knew other methods, you'd be open to considering them? But again, it's also about not being fundamentalist in the approach. Like I was saying earlier, you know, we have a similar type of debate, and I hope I'm not being too controversial, but around things, energy, you know, approach to generating energy in South Africa, and the conversation around coal, for example. we have land in Africa as African farmers that we need to produce on. We need to address our food security, and we need to address the issues that we're facing as Africans with regards to poverty and education. In any approach to dealing with our problems, we cannot forget that. It's something that we can ignore. So I hope that without giving an answer to poverty and education, saying that, absolutely, this has to be part of the conversation. Otherwise, you're not even really going to get an audience with a farmer who's thinking about, I need to get as much of this crop so I can pay school fees. And they're not necessarily thinking about the bullfrog. We need to make the conversations relevant. And that's what I mean when I say relevant, is talk about the farmers' problems, which often include those social issues.
But if I can add to that, I think I would disagree about that the conversation had not been about poverty, because a lot of what we were saying up to this point has to do with what is the ability of the small-scale farmer to make these changes, and acknowledging that we as a society need to be able to provide them with the ability to even be talking about the bullfrog and not about what's the next meal on the table. So, and I think one of the important things to highlight in this particular regard is that what we haven't been very good at is to get to the true cost of production. And by true cost of production, I mean, what are the costs of that biodiversity that we're going to lose? And what are the costs of the potential climate mitigation that we're going to lose? And not just, the product itself. And to be able to, and also not just immediately, but also, in the long term. So not just for this farmer, but cross-generational. And what is the cost to the society more broadly? So, and once we have that conversation, what we need to be discussing is how do we share that cost equitably? And equitably, I mean, not both, between rural and urban populations, but also globally, because Africa holds a huge amount of biodiversity that a lot of the world considers a global asset. And so there's all this pressure on Africa to conserve this biodiversity. And I think that is right, but the cost must be equitably shared. And that is the conversation that I think we're really failing at, is how do we, and I'm not talking about, some funding to conserve a protected area. I'm talking about how do we share that even in production landscapes? How do we incentivize and get the money that's necessary for that incentive must be coming from a broader, a broader society than just locally. So.
Hayley, have you got any comments or remarks? I'm very aware we're coming sort of to the end of our scheduled hour. I think we can have an informal conversation after. We're going to stop recording in 4 to 5 minutes, and then we can have continue the conversation after if anyone wishes to do so.
And I think both Fazlur and Lisa answered the question around, particularly linked to poverty really well. But I just wanted to add something in terms of meat specifically, because that was kind of the other part of the question. And of course, there's this global drive to recognition that we need to cut down on meat consumption because of its impact both on the climate, but also on biodiversity. Again, I think nuance is necessary here because, of course, wealthy people that are over consuming should cut down. We're not saying everyone in Africa needs to cut down on meat consumption. Of course, we've got, again, coming back to there's actually issues with protein deficiency in many parts of the continent. And also there's a difference between many African rangelands and the systems that are particularly problematic, which is, highly intensive pastureland. So again, the distinction I think is important. I also saw that there's somebody in this webinar that I've just pulled it up here, Paul, that produces cultivated meat in bioreactors. And I think coming back to the point of, going back to that graph of do we intensify or do we expand, and the fact that we need to think out of the box and beyond that, I think maybe that's a really nice example. Of course, we can have a big debate about it, but it's a really nice example of, well, maybe there's other ways to meet demand that aren't either of those options. And then just to say finally, I think what's so fascinating when we talk about food security in Africa is how little wildlife meat comes into the conversation. And why is that? You know, if cattle is vulnerable to climate change and it's bad for biodiversity, well, African rangelands are also excellent places to have indigenous herbivores that are also good to eat. It's not always done sustainably, but maybe we should have also more of a conversation around how do we meet the growing need for meat from indigenous wildlife as well.
Thank you. I was sitting here throughout this webinar hoping that today was the first time that the three of you worked together. And I hope that in the future, because I could see so much interaction between the two researchers, for example, and then Fazlur really being able to bring, you know, the experience with the farmer. So I could see, yeah, that would be really good to, and that's always part of the challenges. You know, we're always running out of time. We could do so much more, which is the case now with the webinar. And there were some other questions that unfortunately we didn't manage to get to, but thank you everyone who participated. Thank you everyone who sent questions. As mentioned, after closing, if anyone would like to have an informal conversation, we'll stop the recording and that can happen for those who are able to. But in the meantime, I would like to thank Hayley, Fazlur, and Elizabeth for their input and significant contribution to this discussion. I think it's been really valuable to have the three of you on the panel and to have your insights and to hear more about your research. So thank you. Thank you very much indeed. The next Tipping Point webinar will take place on the 25th of May, and then we'll focus on a discussion about managing rangelands in Africa. And it will include Alan Savory on the panel, as well as Max Macuvis, who is the director of Shangeni Holistic in Zimbabwe, and Roland Kroon, a farmer and businessman. You can sign up to this webinar via link in the chat box. And if you like, please sign up to our newsletter to keep up to date with events, and a link is also available in the chat. And for this webinar, a recording will be uploaded by the Oppenheimer Generations Research Conservation YouTube channel, and a write-up of this webinar will also be available on the website. So yeah, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Tipping Points webinar in May. So yeah, goodbye for now.